Do you know what hazards at your offices could cause a crisis for your agency or company? I'm Edward Segal, a leadership strategy senior contributor for Forbes.com and author of the best-selling and award-winning book, Crisis Ahead: 101 Ways to Prepare for and Bounce Back from Disasters, Scandals, and Other Emergencies. My guest today is John Doney, who's the Vice President of Workplace Strategy at the National Safety Council. He'll share his advice and insights about the workplace-related dangers that can cause a crisis and what could be done about them. Well, thanks for joining me today, John. I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you. Glad to be here and great to talk about this topic today.
For those who may not be familiar with the National Safety Council, tell us a little bit about its mission and activities.
Sure. So we're a 110-year-old nonprofit. Our founding was back in 1913. And our mission is to save lives from the workplace to any place. We do that across a number of different domains, primarily workplace safety, but also roadway safety. And cutting across those two disciplines is the issue of impairment, which spans everything from substance misuse to fatigue to stress and mental distress. And that obviously cuts into both workplace and transportation safety. So our mission is really to help people live their fullest lives wherever we can, however we can, in terms of eliminating preventable death and injury.
From your perspective, how can dangerous and hazardous conditions in the federal or corporate workplace cause injuries or death that could create a crisis for those organizations?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's one that honestly has spanned our entire existence as an organization. And I think we saw crisis as early as, 1913 or before, and that was really the impetus for our founding. So if you think about those historical events long ago, things like the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire, which is a really famous crisis and disaster that led to really the expansion of the safety movement in the U.S., through to the founding of OSHA in the 70s, through to, our more modern approaches. We've seen over and over again that safety and health issues can, and in fact do, lead to crisis situations. So in the more modern day, you can think about big incidents that everyone's probably fairly familiar with, things like the Bhopal disaster, Texas City, Macondo, the Challenger and Columbia disasters, even COVID, I think really qualify as issues that really arose out of health and safety that led to massive crisis on the part of some of these organizations. And even though we've spent many years learning and improving on that front, the size and scale of these disasters, both from a human toll and a financial toll, are still massive. And although we've learned all of these lessons over time, we still, continue to be challenged by certain issues, including, lack of psychological safety and ability to speak up. That, reckoning with that human element, that still, lead to disasters and crises today. So I think that, often it's only an issue of what size or scale the crisis is, and not whether one will happen. Obviously, something like COVID has a mass global scale, whereas for an individual fatality or safety issue, you may see a company-wide or a business-wide crisis, but perhaps not a national one. So I think the short answer is there's a wide variety of ways in which safety and health issues can cause crises, but inevitably left unchecked and undealt with, they always do to some extent or another.
I certainly remember the Triangle Fire. Not that I was there, but I remember it from the history books. For those who may not remember that crisis, can you tell us a little bit about it, and why did it lead to the founding of your organization?
Yeah, absolutely. So it was a horrific event in which hundreds of people died, mostly shirt factory workers, garment factory workers, and many of those were women at the time. And really, the reason that happened was a very simple, preventable reason. Back in those days, factory owners often would close and lock the fire doors, if they indeed existed in a factory at the time, to prevent workers from stepping away from their stations and getting a breath of fresh air, doing whatever else would have been perceived as unproductive. And when the fire started in the factory, because the doors were locked to reduce the potential of workers being unproductive, it led to virtually everyone in the factory being killed as a result of the incident. So, obviously that was a massive wake-up call for the United States, but there were certainly other incidents around that same time, both domestically and globally, that should have taught us the same lesson. And in light of that, it's disheartening to know that incidents like that still happen today, sometimes for very similar reasons in many cases. But in any event, the National Safety Council really was formed out of a group of industry leaders at the time, folks who worked for large and small companies who said, you know what, this doesn't need to be the price of doing business. We can do things better. We can learn from one another. We can instill, this spirit in other owners and other business leaders, and we can codify the practices that we need to adhere to make sure this doesn't happen again. So really, that was what led to our founding. And then since then, the scope and the mission have changed over the years. But that spirit of really learning from one another, preventing these things from happening, is the core remit of the organization.
So fast forward to today, what are the specific examples of dangers and hazards that workers are facing today, and how are their employers responding to those potential hazards?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the number and type of hazards workers are facing is potentially incalculable. It really depends on the operating environment. But if you think about the average worker today, most people work for a small or medium-sized organization for the most part, and about 80% of NSC members are small and medium-sized organizations. And that tends to mean that they don't necessarily have all of the know-how, all of the resources, all of the personnel and bandwidth that would help address some of these safety and health issues in the field. So for a worker going into let's say an average manufacturing environment, there are the very obvious physical hazards that they may face. Maybe things like heat exposure, chemical exposure, moving parts and presses in a big factory setting. It could be smaller scale things like slips and falls, or things that are repetitive in nature, like ergonomic injuries, or MSDs, as they're called, musculoskeletal disorders. But I think also there's an increasing attention on the psychosocial, non-physical risk factors that workers face, and how those can impact their physical safety. So if you think about a worker who maybe comes from an underserved population, maybe English isn't their first language, they're coming into that same work setting without being able to interpret and read the, potentially the signs and the protocols and the processes that have been put in place to address safety. Or they may not feel comfortable, given their standing in the organization, with raising their hand and saying, hey, I see something that's concerning to me, or, hey, I only got 2 hours of sleep last night. I really, maybe should think about calling off. So it's that whole composite of both the very obvious physical risks that you see when you go in and observe a facility or a work setting, as well as the untold number of things that are external factors in to an individual worker at any one time. So it's really only just been in the past maybe 10 years that organizations are waking up to those below the surface issues, even if they've done a really good job at addressing the physical hazards. So, again, it depends on the work setting, but in almost every case, you've got some form or fashion of, potential risk for physical injury and psychological injury going into a workplace. And for really extreme settings, agriculture in extreme heat in California, or repetitive motion on a manufacturing floor of assembling the same part over and over again. Even those things that may not cause you physical discomfort for one day, when extended over a year or extended over 5 years or 10 years, can certainly have a massive toll on an individual.
Are you seeing any specific trends in the workplace concerning deaths and injuries?
Absolutely. And NSC has a long history of monitoring the trends and the data. We're very much data driven. We look at the main sources of injury, the things that are underlying those factors, and really create programs and resources to address them. And we get data on about a 2-year lagging cadence. The federal surveillance infrastructure to understand workplace deaths and injuries tends to collect that about a 2-year lapse from the actual date. So we've just gotten hold of 2021 data in the past few months. And the trend is actually pretty alarming. The number of workplace deaths spiked up to just close to 4,500. I believe it's 4,472 workplace fatalities in 2021. And that was a fairly significant uptick from 2020. If you look at the past 20 years in general, that number of fatalities has remained relatively flat. We tend to be between about 4,000 to 5,000 workplace fatalities every given year. while the trend on our injuries tends to go down a little bit. We tend to get better at taking care of the less severe things, but not any better at taking care of the really severe things, the things that can and often do throw us into crisis. The other piece that I think bears mentioning is that we have very limited data on the trends in illnesses in the workplace and illnesses that lead to death in the workplace. So you could think about things like silicosis or mesothelioma that tend to come from workplace exposure. Being able to count and understand the scope of those sorts of deaths is really difficult, and we have to rely on multiple sources of information. Some estimates put it in the multiple hundred thousands per year. So just a massive scope and scale of that, which is undercounted and underrepresented. The other trends we're seeing beyond just the macro numbers, of course, is going to be reflected in the type of work and where the economic trends are going. So, from an illness perspective, we obviously saw a fairly large uptick, we believe, there because of COVID. Seeing the 2021 data, that obviously be really relevant in those numbers. But we also tend to see, fairly consistent ways in which people generally tend to get injured. Slips, trips, and falls, falling from heights, getting sprains and strains from a muscle perspective, getting hit by something in a facility, whether that might be a piece of equipment or a fork truck or just a swinging piece of machinery or what have you. Those tend to be pretty consistent. The causes of death tend to vary widely dependent on what happened in a given year, but again tend to follow those same trends. So I guess what I would say is an overall uptake on this front is that the trend is that the numbers aren't going anywhere very fast, and that's what's been incredibly alarming to us. Is despite increased knowledge, new approaches, new focus on serious injuries and fatalities, we haven't seen the trend dip in the direction we'd like it to.
Aren't you concerned, though, about the 2-year lag in getting the most current data and also these gaps you just mentioned in terms of the categories of information you have access to? Are we getting a full picture of dangers in the workplace?
Increasingly, we're trying to through sources that aren't traditional. So I would say the 2-year gap has always been concerning, but it's a federal data collection effort, and we understand it takes time to synthesize all that information. Companies are asked to submit their official records if they're required to for reporting in February typically. That all goes into a database, all gets analyzed and cross-tabbed, and so we know that takes time. So there's only so much we can do on that front. However, a big part of our effort is to go get actual data and in-field practice from organizations, work with them to build benchmarking and best practice type coalitions to share information and knowledge and better understand their data. So a great example of this is we launched a program called the MSD Solutions Lab about a year and a half ago, focused on ergonomic injuries and musculoskeletal disorders. We've created a pledge community. When you pledge into that community, you can share your data with us. That's real-time data. We can use that to benchmark and provide guidance for you and for everyone else in that cohort. So those sorts of voluntary efforts to collect the data, whether they're being done by NSC or other nonprofits or other agencies, have been a really helpful way to bridge that data gap. But as with almost anything, the closer you look at it, the more you find potential for improvement. And one of the big areas we've been focused on in the past couple of years is the dearth of data from a demographic perspective as well. If we cross-look at several data sets, we understand that it looks as though underserved populations and people of color tend to be injured at higher rates, in part because they tend to be in an environment where they may take jobs that are riskier in terms of what they have access to. But that data isn't all collected in one clear place, and it leads to a lot of questions about whether those demographic issues have a real bearing on safety and health, and to what extent. So even at a macro level, we know there are data gaps. When you go down to a micro level and try to solve specific problems, we find even further data gaps. So it's obviously a big concern of ours, and one of the things we've been talking with our partners at and agencies federally and state level to enhance and to do more with. So we've had a sort of an always-on campaign around data validity, data and surveillance quality for many, many years now.
Are there dangers and risks in the workplace that you're seeing recently that weren't even on the horizon 10, 15, or 20 years ago?
Certainly. So I think that, perhaps it's not that the dangers weren't there. Perhaps it's that our understanding of those dangers have changed and are now more attentive and attuned. One of the really obvious ones, just talking about COVID as we were, that's been, something that came and now in many cases has left the workplace in terms of the way we approach that risk factor. Hopefully some of the learnings we had from COVID from a workplace safety perspective do tend to stick around. I think a lot of organizations have gotten smarter about their sick leave policies and the way they approach physical work environments and things of that nature. But I mentioned the psychosocial risk factors earlier in the conversation here, and that's a whole category of risk factors that when I first came into the profession 15, 17, 18 years ago, we weren't talking about much, if at all. And if we were talking about them more from a physical well-being perspective. And in the early aughts and 10,000, 2010s, that was a nascent conversation, an emerging conversation. We were talking about ways to address it, but we weren't being very mature or systemic in terms of targeting the risk. That's taken some advances, and we're now seeing much more systemic and data-driven approaches to addressing well-being or health risk in the workplace, although not everywhere and not with every organization. So I think that whole category of the human side of things, whether it's your physical or mental well-being, or whether it's an understanding of human error and how we think and perceive, that was not a conversation we were having much 20 years ago either. Now we know that if we're not creating the capacity to fail safely in our organizations, we're really setting workers up for potential hazardous situations. And the old school mentality was when we saw that sort of thing, well, we'd retrain them, and if we couldn't retrain them, we'd blame and shame them and we'd fire them. So that's changed drastically over the years to where mature organizations now have a much better understanding of how human factors fit in to our risk profile and how we think about that in the workplace.
Well, looking forward, can you strategize or, I guess, play futurist, if you will, for dangers in the workplace 5 or 10 years from now that we're not even thinking about today?
Sure. Yeah, no, that's one I love thinking about, as much as it's a difficult conversation because we're talking about negative potential things happening. I think that we when we think about 5 to 10 years out, we usually tend to think a lot about technology. NSC does have a whole safety technology program put together called Work to Zero, which is focused on safety tech, particularly for serious injury and fatality prevention. But the reason I bring up technology is, it's certainly going to be something that is going to create opportunity to address a lot of the risks and hazards we see. But what it may also do is create new risk factors and hazards. So a couple of good examples of that, or at least one really good example that we're starting to see even now, is as we've enhanced technology for training, for instance, new channels of training, micro learning, ability to get people just in time information when they need it. It's proved really, really useful in terms of spot refresh for maybe a complex task or something that you don't do often that might be risky. But it also carries the potential of that sort of YouTube level of knowledge, right? When you go and Google something that you want to go do because you haven't done it around your house before and make a repair, you might watch a 3-minute video and feel like you're totally ready to go take on the task. Unless you've been pretty extensively trained in something prior to that, if you're an electrician, okay, go into your circuit box and go deal with that. That's fine. But otherwise, a 3-minute training is probably not going to cut it. So thinking about how the way we serve up information to people and when and how for them to be competent to do a task, because we're leveraging these new technologies, creates a whole new set of risk factors. Another big one, and this is on everyone's mind right now, and I kind of hardly turn around a corner without hearing someone talking about the way we're utilizing AI and natural language processing and machine learning tools. From a safety and health perspective, that carries a couple of big risks. One is validity of the information when it comes to using those sorts of tools to help derive an insight or communicate something to your workforce. We all know that there's inherent biases and gaps in those models because they're created whole cloth from everything we've put out there in the world, and we're biased and flawed people, right? So there's a lot of potential for harm there. The other is on sort of the far end of that spectrum when you get to potential actual use of AI tools to inform decision making. So if you think about a future state scenario where you have computer vision in your factory setting that can identify someone not wearing personal protective equipment or can identify a spill that might have happened, you now have the potential to link that into an NLP or an AI tool that could identify that, tag it, create notifications, start to take action essentially without even human intervention in the middle, right? So the question becomes, at what point do you trust the tool you have in place to make the informed decision, and when do you need to intervene with a human perspective? How do we engage in that human AI interaction from an ethics of decision making perspective? Now that's pretty high hanging fruit. That's not anything someone needs to worry about tomorrow. But on a 5 to 10 year horizon, if we think these tools are going to be in use widely across industry, then we definitely need to think about the second line implications of those tools from a safety and ethics perspective.
Well, focusing back on today, which companies and federal agencies do you think are doing an excellent job of preventing or mitigating workplace-related injuries and deaths?
Yeah, I think a lot of organizations are trying to and have the right intention. So we have a couple of groups at NSC that are good examples of this. Our Campbell Institute, which was formed in 2012, is really a home for mature organizations who want to help each other get better, right? The goal is really to enable them to improve and enable the whole world to improve on the back of what we learn from these more mature organizations. We have a number of networks that are either cross-industry or perhaps industry-focused specifically on going after the new and greatest innovation solutions, tactics they can use to keep people safe. It'd be easier to name it that way, I think, than call out specific organizations, because almost everybody has something that might be valuable to you. And what we've learned is when organizations are at their sort of lowest point, if they have had a major incident or injury recently, they tend to also be at their most ready point for learning. They're vulnerable, they're hungry, they want to fix, they want to get better. So even organizations who are at a low ebb on that front tend to have something productive and valuable to give into the conversation, even if it's by virtue of not doing the thing that they did or understanding what they could have done differently. So I think there are a lot of organizations out there doing it. It's more about finding where those companies are convening. So that might be through things that our friends at NIOSH or OSHA put together in the federal side, or it could be things that NSC do, or our sister type organizations like ASSP, the American Society of Safety Professionals, or AIHA, the American Industrial Hygiene Association. They do many of the similar types of things that NSC does as well in terms of bringing that information together and putting it into the public domain. So I think it's about engaging with your industry peers first, and then coming to organizations like NSC to see what's cross industry and what we can help you with.
How proactive, though, is OSHA and the parent agency, the Department of Labor? How proactive are they in helping to prevent or mitigate or providing advice to companies and organizations and federal agencies to be proactive in addressing this issue?
Yeah, I think OSHA is as proactive as it can be in any given year, given the budget constraints that it may have. So, I think OSHA has a primary objective for enforcement activity, right? For understanding what's, assessment and enforcement of what's taking place in the field. So that often leads people to view them as a negative agency that's not necessarily proactive or preventative. But on the other side of the coin, you've got programs like OSHA's VPP program or Voluntary Protection Program, which is aimed at understanding what organizations are doing well, helping to share those learnings out, and they run a whole conference every year, VPP Association, around what organizations in that cluster are doing to really improve things. So through venues like that, or through communications campaigns like Safe and Sound that OSHA does on a year-round basis, those are the more proactive elements that they're able to bring to bear in terms of taking that action. And then they convene groups of great stakeholders and thinkers through things like NACOSH, which is the National Advisory Council on Occupational Safety and Health, which gets cross-industry, gets labor perspective, gets governmental perspective, gets NGO perspectives and business perspectives on what we should be doing collectively to move the needle forward. So again, I think they're doing a really good job from a proactive perspective within, again, the limitations of the budget they have to operate under, because a lot of that needs to go toward their core purpose of enforcement and assessment and inspection.
What's your advice for agency managers and corporate executives who have not yet taken steps to help prevent workplace-related injuries or deaths?
Yeah, I think it's start by coming to us for one, by coming to anybody who has free resources available. And I think you'll find that whether you turn to OSHA or whether you turn to NIOSH, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, or whether you turn to NSC, you're going to find a huge swath of free resources that are there to help you. What may be more challenging is understanding exactly where to start. And so I would say, on that front, it's never a bad idea to talk to your employees, talk to your workforce, and understand what they see and perceive as risky. Engaging your people is going to be a key step, regardless of whether you're a 5,000 person organization or a 5-person organization. Engage your people, ask them what they're thinking and feeling, and then start engaging in some sort of formalized assessment of the risks and hazards you have. If you're just doing things ad hoc and whack-a-mole style, you're never going to get to true improvement. You might fix one thing and have another thing pop up on the other side. So I think engaging and getting systemic and formalized around risk assessment and hazard identification are two of the easiest things you can do when you want to start the journey. And then go seek help, because there's lots of people who are willing to help you, lots of people who have been doing this for 50 years, who want nothing more than to be able to use that knowledge and that influence to help a small organization or any organization keep its people in good shape and send them home as good or better as they were when they showed up in the morning.
How do you think organizations should account for this type of crisis in their crisis management plans?
Yeah, I think it should be a key part of it. If you think about enterprise risk management or risk management activities on the whole in an organization, which is typically where your crisis plan will be housed or seated, making sure that safety and health has a seat at that table and is informing that plan, that continuity plan. Because if you're not starting from, having your paper in front of you on what you're going to do when these things happen, and then you don't go rigorously tabletop exercise it and understand what's going to happen when it actually plays out, then you'll end up in a situation we're probably all still far too familiar with, which is what happened in March of 2020 rather, when we were all really coming to grips with COVID-19 and realized maybe we have an infectious disease crisis management plan, but it might have been a couple pieces of paper with no real understanding of where we go from here. And so in real time, everyone then understood, okay, this is a really significant health issue, safety and health issue. Now we need to deal with it. So I think it's not just getting the crisis plan done and not just about having safety and health involved. It's about really going out and understanding what it looks like when it happens in a controlled setting. Because there's the many famous quotes about that, including that everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face, which is one you've probably heard before. But that's the reality that we've all seen over and over again. So to harden those plans and to make them robust and actually tactical and have them play out is a key step for organizations.
Are there any role models or templates that you recommend that others follow to help lessen the chance that they'll face this type of crisis?
Oh, sure. I mean, there are lots of great templates and models out there. OSHA has one, NSC has one, the various flavors of the International Standards Organization, ISO. They have great standards that help from a template perspective, like ISO 45001, which is their integrated safety and health environmental standard. You can also go to a lot of organizations like NASA, for instance, which by virtue of being a federal agency sort of has to publish its management system and its safety and health approach online. So they have a lot of that available. You can go grab sample policy statements, understand what they do to manage risk. So going to those sorts of storehouses and clearinghouses for this information is a great starting point. And then, NSC has a variety of examples of if you've decided to go this direction, here's how you could implement that from an internal policy perspective. Here's some examples of what you might put in your language. Here's some protocols you could use. Here's some actual tactical plans you could go use in the field. So that's widely available. And I'd say my advice is to not get too tripped up on which flavor of template you're using, because they're all cut generally from a similar type of cloth. And worrying about whether you're doing the best version of something is usually going to just delay you from doing the pretty good version of something. And really letting perfect be the enemy of good is not something you want in a safety and health scenario. You want to continue to improve and iterate year over year, but just getting started and doing something is far preferable to doing nothing.
When testing their crisis management plans to help make sure that they'll work when needed, what workplace-related crisis scenarios should they practice responding to?
Oh gosh, well, there's a number of them, and they're dependent on your business and what you engage in every day. But I'd say for a typical organization, certainly we all usually do the weather-related ones like tornado drills and earthquake drills. Those are obviously clear crisis management pieces you want in place. But for many organizations of any scale doing risky work, you're going to be looking at things like confined space entry and retrieval, rescue sorts of crisis plans. You're going to be looking at fire, obviously, or chemical spills or chemical release. They're going to be looking at infectious disease. Particularly in light of COVID and what we've seen, all of those are really good scenarios to go look at. But then also, I'd say just having an understanding of what happens if it doesn't seem to be a crisis, if it seems to be just one thing, if it seems to just be that one person fell from height and was killed in a workplace fatality, that might not seem like it should go in your crisis plan. But I would say that if that happened, it's probably an indication that there are latent systemic issues, cultural issues, et cetera, that are probably driving you toward the brink of a crisis. So understanding how to deal with even a single incident and look back at what's going on in your organization, to me, that's also a bread and butter piece of a crisis management plan. And thinking about, any serious injury or fatality in your organization really should be the trigger point for some self-examination, reflection, and kind of going back to that crisis plan book to treat this with the seriousness it deserves.
I'm afraid we're almost out of time today, but what's the most important thing you'd like people to remember from our conversation?
Sure. I think it's that when you think about crisis, I think we often think about those things that are massive in scale, that are global, that have so many dimensions to them, perhaps economic, perhaps cultural, perhaps business related. But I don't know that we always think about them in terms of the human impact and how the individual person or worker fits into them. And so I think I would urge every organization listening to this to think about a crisis as being as small as just one serious incident in your organization, because when you peel back the layers from that, you're often going to find really potential issues across the board in your operations. And if you're not taking a fine-tooth comb to those and looking at those with seriousness, you're really setting yourself up for the next crisis. So I think that would be my main takeaway here, is that safety and health has a seat at this table. You should be listening to the folks in your organization that you've given authority for that when it comes to crisis management, and those conversations should be happening in the same room at the same time.
Well, that's great advice, insights, and recommendations, and I want to thank you again for being on Crisis Ahead, John.
Thank you. It's been great to have this conversation with you, and looking forward to chatting further in the future.
That's it for this edition of Crisis Ahead. My guest today was John Doney, the Vice President of Workplace Strategy at the National Safety Council. Be sure to come back next week for more advice and insights on preparing for, managing, and recovering from a crisis. Or subscribe to Crisis Ahead wherever you get podcasts. Remember, it's not a matter of if a crisis will hit your organization or company, it's when. And the sooner you are prepared for it, the better.
Produced by Heartcast Media.